I want to start this talk with a true confession, or at least it's mostly true. And it has to do with clicking on some clickbait online. Usually I'm pretty good. I don't indulge. I can successfully resist those little tiles at the bottoms of articles with buxom women and fantastic gizmos of various kinds, unrecognizable foods, and wild claims about their health effects. None of that gets to me. But one day I saw a woman looking very distressed. This was online, a picture of a woman looking very distressed. And the title of this bit of clickbait said, "The academic article so depressing, it's sending people to therapy." Well, as some of you know, I make my living as an academic. I teach courses in literature and writing. And when I saw that, knowing what I know about academic papers and things like that, I thought, well, that's just not possible. Nothing that could be constituted an academic paper could send people to therapy. And what I found out is that it was all about a paper written by a professor in the UK. His name is Jem Bendel. And his paper is called Deep Adaptation. And I read the paper. It's all about climate change. But it's not just your run-of-the-mill climate change article. It's a fairly lengthy, detailed paper about the trends that can be seen in climate change science. Now, I've read a lot of things in my life because, as I said, that's what I do for a living. I read things and I write things, and read some very disturbing things in my life. And I really was at a point where I thought there's nothing I could read that would ever really, really upset me. But this paper really did. I was not prepared for what I read there. The climate change that Jem Bendel is talking about is catastrophic climate change. And he describes how current science across the board in the area of climate change suggests that humanity is running headlong on a course that will culminate in an environmental catastrophe. And not only that, but it will happen in the near term. And at the time he was writing, which was, I guess, 2018, he sort of expected this to take place within 10 years. Now, when we're talking about catastrophic climate change, we're referring to the kind of change that reaches a certain tipping point, after which a series of climatic feedback loops cause severe, irreversible, runaway disruptions to the planet's climate. Disruptions that would likely result in crop failures around the world, and famine, mass migrations, disease, war, and ultimately, according to Bendel, the collapse of organized societies around the world. But that's not all. He and other people that study climate change suggest that runaway climate change can quite possibly culminate in a mass extinction event of the kind that has happened 5 times in the past in Earth's history. At least one of those mass extinction events resulted in the extinction of 90% of all plant and animal species. And so, were such a thing to happen again, it would be the sixth mass extinction, a global annihilation that really, truly, many experts believe is already underway. The United Nations University, for example, recently estimated that plant and animal species are going extinct at a rate 1,000 times greater than that of the normal background rate. Another study concluded that about 150 plant and animal species go extinct every day. What most people don't realize about all this, however, is that human beings are also on the list of plants and animals that may not be able to survive what is coming. So for several days after reading Bendel's article, I was just really kind of overwhelmed with feelings of grief, anger, fear, dread, anxiety. I guess if I hadn't been a long-time Zen practitioner, I might indeed have needed a therapist, who knows. I certainly had some burning questions like, if humanity is destined to die out, if there is no one left to benefit from the Buddha Dharma, is there any reason to practice Zen? Does our practice need to change in the light of knowing, as Dharma teacher and environmental journalist Catherine Ingram has put it, that we may be approaching the end of human legacy? And that would include Dharma legacy. These questions became the central koans of my life. They arose with a kind of burning intensity as a consequence of reflecting on what is already an existential threat. I'm not just saying that there's possibly a threat. I'm saying the threat exists. Now, what will happen in the future, no one knows. But the threat, an existential threat, has already been made by nature. Now, I can imagine that some people would greet this news with, let's say, a kind of resignation or despair, a sense of hopelessness, apathy, perhaps, because their thinking is, well, the window to do something about climate change is already closed. It's unavoidable. And so we should quit even trying to do something about it. You know, this kind of hopelessness, to me, generally suggests that there is no reason to take action, that really one ought to maybe adopt a stance of inactivity, since all action is futile. So that's a view. But I would ask, have you ever tried to give up activity? Well, periodically I have tried. It's very hard. I couldn't sustain it at all. Not even maybe for 15 minutes. It's a lot of work to give up on the assumption that action is futile, hopeless. I'm not suggesting that we adopt some kind of toxic hope, and I'll address that maybe a little bit later. I'm just saying that resorting to inactivity requires a lot of effort. And in the meantime, it doesn't do anything to alleviate our suffering or the suffering of others. In fact, it just creates more. So the way I look at it is if action is unavoidable. I guess I would vote in favor of actions that are virtuous, actions that work toward the end of suffering. And in the Zen tradition, those kinds of virtuous behaviors are known as the Six Paramitas. Now, in other Buddhist traditions, 10 are identified, and those are worth looking at when you have a chance. But I will stick to the Six Paramitas that the Zen tradition focuses on. And I want to talk about them in relation to this, to the potential for this catastrophic climate event, not because I want to stubbornly cling to things that I know or that I'm familiar with, but because I do believe the Six Paramitas can help us understand both ourselves and the situation we find ourselves in. So, what are these virtues? There are 6 of them, as I said: generosity, morality, patience, effort, meditation, and wisdom. They are known as the 6 perfections or the 6 paramitas. They are virtues that we can develop, that we would like to perfect over the course of our lives. The first of these, generosity, it's known as dana-paramita. In its ideal form, is the ability to give when people need something and you have it to give, that you give it in an immediate, spontaneous, open-handed way without any vacillating and without any thought about what you might get in return. Unfortunately, it's not so easy to be that kind of giving person because we're conditioned, especially I think in the United States, to think of material wealth and the accumulation of material wealth as a good thing. We think of that as virtuous in our society. In other words, we're kind of encouraged from the get-go to buy low and sell high. And we're bred to think that accumulating ever greater amounts of wealth is not just appropriate, but a social good. And it goes further. It's, if wealth is good, accumulating wealth is good, then increasing wealth is even better. Even if we increase it beyond what we need or deserve. In other words, to quote this old movie, Wall Street, greed is good. It's been said Americans don't care about anything except money. There's also been a critique of that, suggesting that it's not money that Americans care about. It's the things that money buys, the material things. It's about having. It's about owning things. Now, many of us have heard that our famed wealth, our very high standard of living, has been founded upon an industrial and capitalistic economic model that extracts resources from the earth and modifies them for sale at a profit. And we're able to do this because we have surplus amounts of energy that come from, let's say, the burning of coal, which we've been doing since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and also the burning of other fossil fuels petroleum products that, for starters, make our cars move. But these days, more and more of us are coming to the painful realization that all this burning of fossil fuels has resulted in, let's call it what it is, a climate emergency. Our vast wealth and our superior standard of living have come at the cost of an existential threat to our species and many other species, perhaps all of them. I mean, seriously, this threat suggests that we may wipe ourselves off the face of the planet. And the first painful part of this has to do with eventually being forced to relinquish things that we can no longer afford. It means that we have to give up certain things. It means that we may be deprived of certain things. Now, here in the United States, that enforced relinquishment may be a ways off, but it is already a reality in other parts of the world. Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, the Mideast. For that matter, Australia, which just a few years ago suffered horrifying tidal waves of wildfires, just like in the American West in past years and in this year's fire season. So it seems to me that the practice of generosity, the first paramita, the practice of giving, in short, is a matter of countering our conditions to mindlessly acquire, to mindlessly own, to want to have, to want to hold. And it can teach us quite a bit about the real nature of relinquishment, the real nature of having. You see, when we practice dana-paramita, giving things to those who need them, we eventually begin to loosen our grip on our compulsive need to have, to own, to accumulate, and become a little more accustomed to the temporary nature of having something. And the more and more often we give, the more we begin to see how easily things come into our lives and go out of them. And that makes it even easier then to see that none of us really has or owns or is able to keep anything. I don't care what the deed says. I don't care what the title says. I don't care what the law says. It's not possible to truly own or have something. And if you think about it, if you could really and truly own something, it would defy the law of impermanence. Nothing is beyond the reach of anicca. Nothing is beyond the reach of impermanence. Everything is subject to change. Ultimately, then, our practice of generosity is an act of simply coming into harmony with the flow of reality. It's the continuous nature of impermanence that means we are already continuously giving and receiving, even if we don't realize it. It is so continuous, in fact, that our so-called hold on things is quite illusory. The giver, in this sense, cannot really give, and the receiver cannot really receive. When you're very clear about this, then the perfection of giving means that even in the face of extinction, you give and receive birth and death. You give yourself to yourself. The second paramita is sila-paramita, the perfection of moral behavior. It makes a nice pairing with dana-paramita. You see, as we increase our skill in being generous people, we come into the embrace of what sila-paramita is all about, which is to do no harm. In our tradition, the way that we ensure that we do no harm is by observing and maintaining the 10 grave precepts, the first of which is to refrain from taking life. Don't kill, don't take life. And I think that must have some rather obvious implications in the context of climate change. In addition, the 10 grave precepts, the grave precepts of refraining from stealing and from being stingy help us perfect the virtue of generosity. So again, you can see how sila-paramita works well as a complement to dana-paramita, generosity. To refrain from stealing means that we do not take what is not given. I would guess most of us feel that we are not thieves, that we do not steal. But there are subtle forms of theft that we engage in whenever we sell something, especially if we're trying to sell it for a profit, which is another way to say we're selling it for more than it's worth. Taking money in exchange for something of less value. A subtle form of theft. And where climate change is concerned, one of the things we have to consider is that our industrialized way of life robs other people of the world of, let's say, like a habitable climate. I mean, already people are suffering terribly in India, the Mideast, Southeast Asia, East Africa. We're looking at temperatures that are so high in some places in India, and I believe in the Mideast, so high that exposure, unprotected exposure to them for more than a few hours can lead to the breakdown of your internal organs. It'll kill you. And then, of course, there is famine in East Africa. Again, we can also look at the grave precept to refrain from lying. To me, this is the most important, period, but also one of the most important in terms of how we live our lives in the context of a potential mass extinction event. I mean, in terms of dishonesty, there are people who have been promulgating, false science, trying to prevent legislation from being written that would help mitigate climate change. Millions, billions, literally billions of dollars have been spent by extremely wealthy individuals to get politicians to deny climate change science. Well, fortunately, fewer and fewer Americans are falling prey to that kind of propaganda. But there are other subtler forms of dishonesty that I really hope we can pay attention here to. And what I'm talking about now is denial, the psychological phenomenon of denial, because we humans have a marked tendency to deny painful truths. It's a defense mechanism, natural, really. It's an attempt to protect the mind. And in the case of having to face the threat of extinction, the will to be honest and truthful about our circumstances seems really nearly unbearable. Catherine Ingram, who I mentioned earlier, I mean, she's a Dharma teacher. And yet, when she became extinction aware, all she could think about was the suffering that her young nephews and nieces were going to suffer, probably after she's gone. And she was so stressed, so pained by this realization and by the further realization that there was nothing she could do to prevent it. She developed a case of shingles. Now, I don't know if you know what shingles is like. It's extraordinarily painful. I would liken it to being stabbed with electrified knitting needles. And she developed lesions, shingles lesions, all over her body in more than one region, which is very unusual, and had to be hospitalized. And then when she was out of the hospital, she had a very long period over which she had to gradually recover. It's a dangerous disease. It can take your life. And so she had to find ways to remain extinction aware, but that kind of cost was too high. Now, in her case, she wasn't in denial. But many people are, because they want to avoid, even if they're not thinking specifically shingles, they're thinking of some kind of unendurable agony, some kind of unendurable pain that they just can't handle, and so they deny it. Now, in the paper that started me on this course of thinking, Jem Bendel's deep adaptation paper, he identifies two forms of denial. The first kind is interpretive denial. And in interpretive denial, this is when like in the context of climate change, people might acknowledge, for example, that yes, the past 10 years have been the hottest years in terms of global average temperature on record. But then they turn around and interpret, I should say, misinterpret, deliberately misinterpret or unconsciously misinterpret these facts to be representative of, let's say, the natural variability to which climate is subject. Climate is always changing. It goes through ups and downs. That's true. But that's not what is happening now. What is happening now is not part of the natural variability of climate. Another common form of interpretive denial occurs because popular media often blend the bad news about climate change with hopeful mentions of technological breakthroughs that might save us from ourselves. Now, this, to me, is toxic hope. Now, it's pretty to think that we're going to invent something that's going to fix the problem. And there have been some wonderful inventions, wonderful ideas on the drawing board, things that really might actually change our world for the better. But as many, many people have pointed out, none of the technological solutions that people have proposed have been developed at scale or can be developed at scale in time to mitigate what is coming. So if we hear about technological breakthroughs that might save us, and we interpret that to mean, yes, we can relax, we're all safe, this is a form of dishonesty. It's a form of self-deception. Unless you believe that all the nations of the world will tomorrow, I mean it literally, drop everything that they're doing and focus exclusively on developing these technologies together, cooperatively, and do nothing else except that, like on an emergency basis. And that's not realistic. I wish it were true, but I think it's highly improbable. So my point here is, let's not kind of unconsciously misinterpret things in order to protect ourselves from a truth we find it hard to bear. The second form of denial occurs when we, and I'm quoting Bendel now, when we recognize the troubling implications of climate change, facts, but respond by busying ourselves on activities that do not arise from a full assessment of the situation. Catherine Ingram explains this kind of denial this way. She writes, "There has never been a greater news story than that of humans facing full extinction. And yet extinction is rarely mentioned on the evening news, cable channels, or on the front pages of blogs and newspapers. It is as though the world's astronomers were telling us that an asteroid is heading our way and will make a direct hit destined to wipe out all of life, to which the public responds by remaining fascinated with sporting events, social media, and the latest political machinations and celebrity gossip." So, denial of the implications. We call it implicative denial. For those of you who are into the Matrix movies, this is like deciding to take the blue pill. And as Morpheus says in the movie, the story, we could say the climate change story in this context, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and you believe what you want to believe. Or you go, shopping at the mall, or binge watch Netflix, or do whatever entertainment oriented thing you want to do to avoid having to face the implications of what you know to be true. Now, for those of you who are taking the red pill with me, let's just say that perfecting the virtue of morality means reflecting on how both interpretive and implicative forms of denial, these subtle things that we do to ourselves, might be affecting our view and our choices. And finally, I want to mention two other grave precepts that can help us develop sila-paramita, to develop the virtue of non-harming. The first is to refrain from blaming others, and the second is to refrain from indulging in anger. In the context of catastrophic climate change, it is very easy to blame others. Once you become extinction aware, it's almost a given that apportioning some blame for our predicament will arise. You wonder, how did we get into this mess? Why weren't our leaders doing anything? It's got to be someone's fault. I didn't create this mess, not me alone. This is what we tell ourselves. And in some sense, it's true. Now, earlier, I laid a portion of blame on industrialists and capitalists because they burned fossil fuels to produce things, to sell. But if we're being honest, we really have to acknowledge that every single one of us contributes to our predicament every single day. Every single day, we take advantage of the things that industry has brought us. Some of it is truly amazing. What an amazing invention was the car. In the 19th century, if you lived on a farm and someone had an accident with a gun, you'd have to take the horse and buggy into town to see the doctor. And you might not make it. Today we have an ambulance that'll get us there very quickly. What about the telephone? I can call for help. What about the electric light bulb? The airplane? Hot water heaters? Plastics of every shape and size? Air conditioning? And the personal computer? All of these wondrous things have come to us at the cost of our planet and maybe our lives. But how long can you go without them? How long can you live without electricity? In some parts of the world and in this country, the water that comes out of your tap arrives there as a consequence of electricity. If that stops flowing, so does the water. How long can you go without your computer? Are you watching this talk on YouTube? The server farms that make it possible for me to talk to you produce copious greenhouse gases. It's not too much of a stretch to say your Google search is a suicide note. Now, sure, I know some people may share a greater portion of responsibility for causing what's coming our way because they do it, with impunity, with a sense of impunity. But the reality is that there is no part of our lives in which the things we do not in some way exacerbate the problem. That is just the nature of being a citizen in the 21st century world we live in. So blame will not really help us accept our lives with a semblance of equanimity or insight or wisdom or compassion. And similarly, it won't help for us to indulge in anger. I do get why people are really angry. When your crops wither in the field, when your livestock die of thirst, when your family goes hungry, and then very little help from the rest of the world, would you not also feel angry? I mean, I can't imagine not feeling angry and upset. But it's well known that when we indulge in anger, it gives rise to hatred. Hatred gives rise to very severe forms of dualistic thinking. A them against us mentality in which it becomes gradually easier and easier to think of others as enemies, to steal from them, say, to lie about them, say, ultimately to perpetuate violence against them, armed conflict, war. So how can we maintain the precepts of refraining from blaming others and indulging in anger? Well, one answer to that is by developing the virtue of patience. And this is the third paramita, ksanti-paramita. Sometimes it's translated as forbearance rather than patience. And I kind of like that. So I will talk about ksanti-paramita and virya-paramita in the next video.